It started with a house, my grandmother's old Victorian home, the kind of place that seemed to hold its breath when you stepped inside. The floors creaked with memories, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets that I wasn't ready to hear. I'd been left the house in her will, a surprise inheritance that came with a single condition. I couldn't sell it. I wasn't thrilled to leave the city, but after a string of bad luck, losing my job, my apartment, and a relationship that went up in flames, moving into her house felt like the only option. The place was isolated, perched on the edge of a forest with towering trees that seemed to lean in, as if trying to peek through the windows. From the moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was off. It wasn't the smell of old wood or the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the air. It was the mirror. The mirror stood at the end of the main hallway, a tall, ornate monstrosity framed in dark mahogany. Its surface seemed too smooth, too polished, as though it absorbed more light than it reflected. It wasn't just any mirror, it was her mirror, the one she'd always kept covered with a thick velvet cloth when I visited as a child. I remember asking her why, and she'd only smile and say, "Some things are better left unseen, my dear." I didn't think much of it back then. Grandmothers are supposed to say weird things, right? But now, standing in front of it, I felt a cold unease settle in my chest. That first night, I left the mirror uncovered, mostly because I was too tired to bother. Moving boxes had drained every ounce of energy I had, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was ready to collapse. As I made my way to bed, I passed the mirror again, catching my reflection in the dim light. Only, it didn't feel like my reflection. I know how that sounds. Paranoia, sleep deprivation, whatever. But as I stood there, staring at the glass, something about the person staring back at me felt wrong. There was no logical explanation for it. My movements were mirrored perfectly, but there was an intensity in their eyes, a sharpness, a presence that didn't feel like mine. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired. I turned away and went to bed, hoping that the unease was just part of adjusting to a new place. But even as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror hadn't stopped watching me. The next day, I decided to cover it, just like she used to. It felt silly, like I was giving in to some irrational fear, but the weight of its presence was too much. I grabbed an old bedsheet and draped it over the frame, careful not to look at the glass as I did. That should have been the end of it. But later that night, as I passed through the hallway, the sheet was gone. It was back to staring at me, its surface gleaming in the faint moonlight spilling through the windows. And this time, I swear, the reflection smiled. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house sent shivers down my spine, and my mind kept circling back to the mirror. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even my imagination playing games after the stress of moving. But deep down, I knew better. Something about that mirror wasn't normal. The next morning, I decided to investigate. It was either that or let the unease slowly eat away at me. I pulled the sheet back over the mirror and studied the intricate frame. The wood felt cold, unnaturally so, and I noticed carvings along the edges, tiny symbols I didn't recognize. They looked ancient, almost like runes, but worn smooth with time. My grandmother had been a collector of oddities. Her house was filled with strange trinkets, dusty books, and antiques she claimed had histories. This mirror must have been one of them, though I couldn't remember her ever talking about where it came from. I spent the day rummaging through the house, hoping to find some clue about its origins. In the attic, buried beneath boxes of old clothes and faded photographs, I found a leather-bound journal with my grandmother's handwriting inside. Most of the pages were filled with mundane entries about her garden or her trips into town, but near the back, the tone shifted. She wrote about the mirror. The glass is more than it seems, one entry read. It shows more than what's in front of it. Sometimes I see things that shouldn't be there. I've tried covering it, but it doesn't help. It's as if it knows. Another entry chilled me to the core. I've seen her in the reflection again. She looks like me, but she isn't. Her eyes, they don't belong to anyone human. I don't know how much longer I can keep it contained. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. Who was she? And what did my grandmother mean by contained? That evening, I avoided the mirror as much as I could. I stuck to the living room, trying to lose myself in an old movie, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway made me freeze. I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned my head. The hallway was empty, or at least it should have been. But then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate steps. They were coming from the direction of the mirror. My heart pounded as I forced myself to stand. Grabbing the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy candlestick, I crept toward the hallway. The mirror stood at the end, still covered by the sheet. But as I approached, I saw something moving beneath the fabric. The sheet was rippling, as though someone, or something, was on the other side of the glass, trying to push through. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave the house, but I couldn't. It was like the mirror had me in its grip, pulling me closer. My hand shook as I reached for the edge of the sheet and yanked it off. The reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. She looked like me. Same face, same body. But her eyes were wrong. They were darker, deeper, as if they held an endless void. And her smile, it wasn't a smile at all. It was a predatory grin, wide and sharp, like she was savoring some private joke at my expense. Who are you? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, as if she'd heard me, she raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I watched in horror as her handprint formed on my side of the mirror, a frosty imprint that began to spread outward, fogging the surface. The lights in the hallway flickered, and the air grew icy cold. I took a step back, clutching the candlestick like it could actually protect me. The figure in the mirror tilted her head, watching me with a cruel curiosity. Then, she mouthed a single word. "Stay." I bolted. I ran to my room and locked the door, my chest heaving with panicked breaths. The house was silent now, but the memory of her face was burned into my mind. She wasn't just a reflection. She was something else, something that had been trapped in the mirror for God knows how long. And now she wanted out. I spent the rest of the night sitting against the door, clutching the journal like it was a lifeline. My grandmother had dealt with this thing for years, and she must have found a way to keep it contained. I just had to figure out how. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't leave the mirror uncovered. Whatever she was, whatever she wanted, the glass was the only thing keeping her from stepping into my world. But for how long? The following days blurred into a haze of paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes felt like her, like the thing in the mirror was watching, waiting. I tried to keep the mirror covered at all times, but the sheet never seemed to stay on for long. Every morning I'd wake up to find it lying crumpled on the floor, the glass gleaming in the dim morning light. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her face staring back at me, her lips curling into that cruel smile. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just in the mirror anymore. Sometimes I'd catch flickers of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the room, a pale hand slipping out of sight. It was on the third night that things escalated. I had barricaded myself in the living room, determined not to go anywhere near the hallway where the mirror stood. The journal sat open on the coffee table, its pages filled with my grandmother's increasingly desperate notes. She had tried everything to rid herself of the mirror, covering it, locking it away, even attempting to smash it. But none of it worked. Breaking the glass only made her angrier, one entry read. The shards reflected her in every piece. She almost got out that time. That line sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Smashing the mirror had been my backup plan, but now I didn't even have that option. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker again. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a cold that seeped into my bones. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, though I had no idea what good either would do, and sat frozen, listening. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Then I heard it, a soft tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't just sit there and let it happen. Heart pounding, I crept toward the sound, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. The tapping grew louder as I approached, more insistent, almost impatient. When I turned the corner, I saw her. She was still in the mirror, but she wasn't standing still anymore. Her hands were pressed flat against the glass, and she was grinning wider than ever, her teeth gleaming like shards of broken porcelain. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. Then she moved. Her hands began to push against the glass, and I watched in horror as the surface rippled like water. It wasn't possible. Glass wasn't supposed to move, but there it was, bending and warping as she pressed harder, her fingers slowly breaking through. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was. The tips of her fingers breached the surface, pale and claw-like, dripping with some kind of black, viscous liquid. She let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound muffled by the glass but still unmistakable. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the freezing night. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. For a moment I thought about leaving, just getting in my car and driving as far away as I could, but I couldn't. The mirror wasn't just some haunted relic. It was a prison, and if I left, I had no doubt she'd find a way to break free. This wasn't just about me anymore. I forced myself back inside, locking the front door behind me. The tapping had stopped, but the air still felt wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath. I crept back to the hallway, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The mirror was still there, and she was gone. The surface was smooth and empty, reflecting nothing but the dim glow of the hallway light. For a moment I thought she'd retreated, that maybe I'd scared her off somehow. But then I saw the writing. It was scrawled across the glass in dripping black letters. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with panic. The mirror began to shake violently, the glass humming with a deep, resonant sound that made my teeth ache. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, glowing faintly with an eerie, otherworldly light. I didn't know what to do. The journal hadn't prepared me for this. All I knew was that I couldn't let the mirror break, no matter what. If she got out. The lights in the hallway exploded, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight and switched it on, the beam trembling as I pointed it toward the mirror. She was back. Her face was pressed against the glass, her mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. The cracks framed her like a shattered picture, and her hands were pounding against the surface, each impact making the mirror tremble. "Stay back," I screamed, raising the knife. I had no idea what I was planning to do. Stab the mirror? Stab her? But she didn't flinch. She just laughed, the sound echoing in my head like a twisted lullaby. The cracks spread further, the light behind them growing brighter, almost blinding. I knew I was running out of time. Desperation took over, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the sheet from the floor and threw it over the mirror. The second the fabric touched the glass, the pounding stopped. The house fell silent, the air still and heavy. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. It was over. For now. But I knew this wasn't the end. She was still there, lurking behind the glass, waiting for her next chance. And I had no idea how much longer I could keep her contained. I barely made it through the next day. My nerves were shot, every noise in the house setting my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't done with me, that she wasn't done with me. The way she grinned, the way she almost broke through, it all felt like a warning. I spent hours flipping through my grandmother's journal, searching for anything I might have missed. Most of it was useless. Notes about her daily life, fragments of strange rituals she'd tried. But one page stood out. It was hidden near the back, folded in half and almost glued to the binding, like she hadn't wanted anyone to find it. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting, and they sent a chill down my spine. If she escapes, it's over. There is no way to stop her once she's free. Beneath it was a single line, underlined twice. Keep the mirror whole, but keep it hidden. She can only take what she sees. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but it felt like my last chance. I needed to move the mirror somewhere, anywhere, she couldn't see me. Somewhere dark, isolated, where no reflections could cross her path. The basement was the only option. That evening, as the sun began to set, I steeled myself for the task. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and grabbed an old bedsheet, duct tape, and gloves. I didn't know if touching the mirror directly would make things worse, but I wasn't taking any chances. The hallway was cold, colder than it should have been. My breath fogged in the air as I approached the mirror, its surface still hidden beneath the sheet. I hesitated, staring at the covered frame. She was behind that thin layer of fabric, waiting. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, though my shaking hands betrayed the lie. Carefully, I gripped the sides of the mirror and tilted it away from the wall. It was heavier than I expected, the weight almost unnatural, like it resisted being moved. Every step toward the basement door felt like an eternity, the mirror's presence pressing down on me with an almost physical force. And then it started, the tapping. Soft at first, like rain against a window, but it grew louder with every step I took. By the time I reached the basement door, it was deafening, a relentless pounding that made my ears ring. The sheet over the mirror began to ripple, as if something underneath it was moving. "No," I muttered, gripping the mirror tighter. "You're not getting out." The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step feeling like it might give way beneath me. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the shadows stretching long and dark across the walls. When I reached the bottom, I set the mirror against the farthest wall, my hands trembling as I pressed it into place. That's when the lights went out. The darkness swallowed me whole, so thick and complete that I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers numb and clumsy, and when I finally switched it on, the beam landed directly on the mirror. The sheet was gone. She was staring at me again, her face inches from the glass, her eyes burning with something far worse than anger. Hatred. Hunger. "You can't stop me," she whispered, her voice slithering through the air like a living thing. "I see you. I always see you." The glass began to crack, fractures spiderwebbing out from where her hands pressed against the surface. The air vibrated with a low, guttural hum, and the room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. I panicked. I grabbed the duct tape and began wrapping it around the mirror, covering the cracks, the edges, anything to hold it together. But it was like trying to hold back a flood with paper. The cracks grew wider, light spilling out from behind them like molten gold. Her laughter echoed through the basement, sharp and mocking. "You think you can trap me forever? You think she could?" The glass bulged outward, warping as if it were no longer solid. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My grandmother's words rang in my head. She can only take what she sees. If that was true, then maybe... Without thinking, I lunged for the flashlight and aimed it at the floor, plunging the mirror into darkness. Her laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ache. For a moment, I thought it had worked. But then I heard her voice again, soft and venomous. "You can't hide forever." The mirror began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter and brighter. The cracks were no longer just cracks, they were openings, and something was pressing against them from the other side. Her hand burst through first, pale and clawed, followed by her face, her grin wider than ever. I screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a rusted crowbar, and swung it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction, each one catching the light like a tiny star. For a split second, everything was silent. Then the room erupted in chaos. The shards began to move, swirling through the air like a cyclone, each one reflecting her face. They crashed into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, and I realized with growing horror that she was everywhere now. Her laughter surrounded me, a cacophony of overlapping voices, and I dropped to my knees, covering my ears. "Please," I begged, "just stop." But she didn't. One by one, the shards began to disappear, fading into the air like smoke. The room grew darker and darker, until there was nothing left but silence and shadows. When I finally opened my eyes, the mirror was gone. The wall where it had been was bare, the floor littered with nothing but dust. But I knew she wasn't gone. She was out now, free in a way she hadn't been before. And as I climbed the basement stairs, my legs weak and my breath ragged, I felt her presence everywhere. In the reflections of the windows, the polished surface of the dining table, even the faint gleam of my phone screen. She could see me, and now there was nowhere left to hide. It's been weeks now and I've barely slept. The house feels different, heavier, like it's suffocating me from the inside. I know she's out there, somewhere. Maybe she's watching me through the faint reflection of the water in the sink, or the smudged surface of the microwave door. Everywhere I go, I see glimpses of her. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching where there shouldn't be one. Sometimes at night I hear her voice, a faint whisper just beyond my hearing. It's not words exactly, but it pulls at me, coaxing me toward reflective surfaces, toward her. I've covered every mirror in the house, every shiny surface, but it doesn't matter. She doesn't need the mirror anymore. She's free now and she's patient. I tried to leave. I packed my bags, grabbed my car keys, and drove for hours, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the house. But it didn't help. She followed me. At a gas station miles away, I caught a glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat of my car, her grin stretching wider than ever. I nearly drove off the road trying to escape. When I finally stopped, shaking and gasping for air, she was gone. But I know she's never far. I thought about smashing every mirror I came across, shattering every surface where she could appear. But the journal's warning echoes in my mind. Breaking the glass only makes her angrier. There's no running, no hiding. I've come to realize that this isn't a battle I can win. She doesn't tire, doesn't falter. She's always watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But I've also realized something else. She thrives on fear. She feeds off it, grows stronger every time I let my terror take hold. So I've stopped running. I've stopped fighting. I still see her, of course, in the sheen of rainwater on the street, in the dull reflection of my coffee mug. Sometimes she's closer than I'd like, her dark eyes locked onto mine, her smile daring me to react. But I don't. I've learned to ignore her. It's not perfect. Some days, my resolve crumbles and I find myself frozen, staring into her reflection, waiting for her to move. But she doesn't. Not completely. Not yet. I've started to wonder if that's the worst part, the waiting. Knowing that one day she'll stop playing this game. One day she'll step fully into my world, and I won't be able to stop her. Until then, I keep going. I've quit my job, cut ties with most of the people I know, It's safer this way, keeping them out of her reach. I don't want anyone else to pay the price for my mistakes, but every night, as I lie awake in the dark, I feel her watching. I hear her faint laughter echoing in the silence. And I know that no matter how long I ignore her, no matter how strong I pretend to be, she'll never stop. The mirror might be gone, but her reflection remains, and so does the fear.